Welcome, dear friends, to a comprehensive journey through 140 facts about hidden abilities, those secret powers that Pokémon possess beyond their standard abilities, introduced in Generation V to add depth to competitive battling and to breeding mechanics, creating additional layer of strategy where obtaining optimal ability became pursuit that dedicated trainers undertook through dream world encounters, through special distributions, through friend safari exploration, and eventually through max raid battles and ability patches that made hidden abilities more accessible than initial implementations allowed when scarcity made them genuinely rare, creating prestige that possession indicated through demonstrating dedication that acquisition required. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Are you cozy in your bed somewhere listening to these soothing Pokémon facts? Or perhaps you're traveling and need something relaxing? Drop your location in the comments below so we can see how far this Pokémon community reaches. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into hidden abilities, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more of these comprehensive Pokémon explorations. Your support means everything and motivates creating more content like this. Tonight, we'll explore everything about hidden abilities across 4 parts, totaling 140 facts, told gently like bedtime stories about the secret powers that breeding unlocks, the competitive advantages that hidden abilities provide, the obtainment methods that evolved across generations, and the strategic decisions that ability choice requires when hidden abilities sometimes surpass standard abilities, while other times standard abilities remain superior, creating choices that team composition and battle format determine, making ability selection into meaningful decision rather than obvious optimization. So settle into comfort, close your eyes whenever sleep beckons, and let us begin this gentle journey through hidden abilities, told soothingly like tales about the powers hidden within Pokémon waiting for discovery. Fact 1. Hidden abilities were introduced in Generation V through Dream World, an online feature where players sent Pokémon to sleep in virtual world, where they explored mini-games and encountered wild Pokémon that possessed abilities different from what standard encounters provided. The Dream World created acquisition method that required patience and that required daily engagement with online service. That server shutdown eventually eliminated, making Dream World exclusive hidden abilities temporarily unobtainable, until later generations introduced alternative methods for accessing abilities that Dream World had initially monopolized through being sole source for obtaining hidden abilities that competitive players required for optimal team building. Fact 2. The term hidden ability derives from these abilities being hidden from standard gameplay, requiring special methods for obtaining rather than being available through normal wild encounters that provided only standard abilities. The terminology emphasizes scarcity and exclusivity that hidden abilities possessed when introduced, making them feel special through requiring effort that casual play didn't demand, creating distinction between players who pursued hidden abilities through engaging with Dream World and players who remained content with standard abilities that normal gameplay provided without additional effort. Fact 3. Drought as hidden ability. On Vulpix and Ninetales transformed these fire types from decent Pokémon into weather setters whose automatic sunlight upon entering battle made them valuable team members. The weather setting ability elevated Vulpix, divided by Ninetales from obscurity into competitive relevance through providing utility that stats alone didn't justify, making hidden ability into defining characteristic that usage depended on creating example, where hidden ability fundamentally changed Pokemon's role from attacker into support, creating versatility that standard abilities couldn't replicate. Fact 4. Drizzle as hidden ability on Politoed created first non-legendary Pokemon that could summon permanent rain, making Politoed into essential team member for rain teams that previously required Kyogre, whose legendary status restricted usage in most formats. The democratization of weather setting through giving non-legendary access to Drizzle created new team-building possibilities that legendary restrictions had prevented, making Politoed into cornerstone of rain strategies, whose viability depended on hidden ability that standard abilities couldn't approximate, making Drizzle Politoed into example where hidden ability created niche that otherwise wouldn't exist. Fact 5. Sandstream as hidden ability on Tyranitar and Hippowdon provided automatic sandstorm that buffed rock types' special defense while damaging non-rock divided by ground divided by steel types, creating weather that offensive and defensive benefits combined. The sandstorm setting made these Pokemon into anchors for sand teams whose strategies revolved around weather that Sandstream provided automatically without requiring move slot that manual weather moves demanded, making ability into efficiency gain that team slots saved through not needing dedicated weather setter whose only purpose was establishing conditions that Sandstream provided passively. Fact 6. Speed boost on Blaziken created banned from standard play Pokemon whose automatic speed increases. Each turn made it progressively faster until nothing could outspeed it, creating snowball effect that opponents couldn't prevent. The ability transformed Blaziken from strong starter into over-centralizing threat, whose ban demonstrated that hidden abilities could be too powerful, creating balance problems that standard abilities avoided through having limitations that speed boost circumvented through providing free stat boosts that set up moves normally required turn investment for obtaining, making speed boost Blaziken into cautionary tale about hidden abilities creating unintended consequences. Fact 7. Protean on Greninja changed user's type to match move being used, creating stab on every attack while constantly changing defensive profile, making Greninja unpredictable and making it always hit with boosted power. The type changing created versatility that few abilities matched through making Greninja into Pokemon without fixed type whose move pool determined typing, creating coverage that type restrictions normally prevented through allowing fire, ice, electric, and other coverage moves to receive stab that mixed attacker normally wouldn't achieve, making Protean into ability that maximized coverage value. Fact 8. Gale Wings on Talonflame gave priority to flying-type moves when Talonflame was at full HP, allowing Brave Bird to strike before opponents acted, making Talonflame into threatening priority attacker. The priority transformation made Talonflame competitively dominant until Generation 7 nerfed ability to only work at full HP, creating example where hidden ability was so strong that modification was necessary for game balance, showing that even after banning Speed Boost, Blaziken developers still sometimes created hidden abilities that proved too powerful, requiring adjustment. Fact 9. Magic Bounce on Espeon and Xatu reflected status moves and entry hazards back at users, creating defensive utility that turned opponent strategies against them. The reflection ability made these Pokemon into anti-support specialists whose presence prevented hazard stacking and prevented status spreading, creating role where Magic Bounce users protected teams from indirect damage and from status conditions that would otherwise accumulate, making ability into team support that value extended beyond individual combat effectiveness. Fact 10. Regenerator on Slowbro, Toxapex, and others healed 1/3 HP when switching out, creating sustainability that allowed repeated switches without accumulating damage. The healing ability made Regenerator users into exceptional pivots whose longevity exceeded normal Pokémon's through healing that switching provided rather than requiring dedicated healing moves, making Regenerator into ability that strategy enabled through switching patterns that maximized healing, making ability into skill testing mechanic, where optimal play required managing switches for maximizing HP recovery. Fact 11. Huge power and pure power on Azumarill, Medicham, and Mawile doubled attack stat, creating physical powerhouses whose offensive presence far exceeded what base stats suggested. The doubling effect transformed modest attack stats into threatening values, making these Pokémon into offensive threats, despite mediocre base stats, creating examples where ability mattered more than stats through providing multiplication that made investment efficient when doubled. Attack made physical moves devastatingly powerful, creating Pokémon whose strength came primarily from ability rather than from base stats. Fact 12. Multiscale on Dragonite reduced damage by half when at full HP, creating defensive insurance that first hit couldn't OHKO, making Dragonite setup sweeper that survived initial attacks. The damage reduction created sustainability that made Dragonite into tank, despite middling defenses through ability negating damage that would otherwise KO, creating window where setup moves could be used safely, knowing that multi-scale protected from revenge killing, making ability into enabler of strategies that vulnerability would prevent. Fact 13. Contrary on Superior reversed stat changes, making moves that lowered stats actually raise them, creating synergy with Leaf Storm, whose special attack drop became special attack boost. The reversal mechanic transformed debilitating drawback into advantageous effect, making Leaf Storm into setup move that simultaneously dealt damage and boosted offensive stat, creating combination that normal mechanics didn't permit, making contrary into ability that fundamental mechanics reversed, creating unique interactions that standard abilities couldn't replicate. Fact 14. Moody on Smeargle and others randomly raised one stat sharply and lowered another stat each turn, creating unpredictable stat changes that luck determined. The randomness made Moody into controversial ability, whose RNG nature meant outcomes varied wildly, creating situations where lucky boosts decided battles, making ability into coin flip that competitive integrity questioned through, introducing excessive randomness that skill couldn't control, making Moody into frequently banned ability, whose random nature competitive play rejected. Fact 15. Sheer force on Nidoking and Life Orb combination created powerful attacker that lost Life Orb recoil when using moves with secondary effects that sheer force removed. The synergy between ability and item created optimal combination, where offensive boost was free through recoil being negated, making sheer force users into ideal Life Orb holders whose power was amplified without normal cost, making ability into economic advantage that made using Life Orb costless when secondary effect removal prevented recoil that normally balanced Life Orb's power boost. Fact 16. Intimidate as hidden ability on some Pokémon provided automatic attack reduction to opponents, creating defensive utility that physical attackers struggled against. The attack lowering created immediate advantage that switch-in provided without requiring actions, making intimidate into ability that value derived from just entering battle, creating cycling strategies where repeated switches accumulated attack drops that physical attackers couldn't overcome, making intimidate into oppressive ability when multiple users rotated, maintaining constant attack debuffs. Fact 17. Unaware on Quagsire and Clefable ignored opponent stat changes when calculating damage, creating defensive wall that setup sweepers couldn't boost through. The stat-ignoring ability made unaware users into setup stoppers whose presence invalidated boosting strategies through treating boosted opponents as unboosted, making stat boosts worthless, creating hard counter to boosting that forced opponents into attacking immediately rather than setting up, making unaware into ability that strategies countered through, making particular approach unviable. Fact 18. Prankster on various Pokémon gave priority to status moves, allowing moves like Thunder Wave, Taunt, and Tailwind to act before opponents moved, creating utility that speed control provided. The priority status moves created disruption that offensive priority couldn't match through affecting battles indirectly, making Prankster users into support specialists whose presence controlled pace through status moves, acting first, preventing opponent actions that would occur before normal status moves could execute, making Prankster into tempo control ability. Fact 19. Technician on Breloom and Scizor boosted weak moves by 50%, making low base power moves into efficient attacks that PP and power balanced optimally. The boost transformed moves like Bullet Seed and Bullet Punch into threatening attacks despite modest base power, creating preference for weak moves that ability boosted over strong moves that ability didn't affect, making Technician into ability that move pool optimization rewarded through selecting moves that boost threshold met, making ability into consideration when building movesets. Fact 20. Adaptability on Crawdaunt and Porygon Z increased stab multiplier from 1.5 times to 2 times, making same type moves even more powerful, creating offensive specialists whose type matching moves hit exceptionally hard. The stab enhancement made adaptability users into wall breakers whose stab moves broke through defenses that normal stab couldn't penetrate, creating power that resistances struggled against, making adaptability into ability that pure offensive presence maximized through making already strong stab moves into devastating attacks that defensive counters needed specific resistances for surviving. Fact 21. Moxie on Gyarados and Salamence raised attack after KOing opponents, creating snowball effect, where early KO made subsequent KOs easier through accumulated boosts. The momentum-building ability rewarded aggressive play that sought KOs, creating positive feedback, where success bred more success, making Moxie users into late-game cleaners who swept through weakened teams after initial KO, triggered boosting cascade, making ability into win more effect that led to total victory after breaking through first opponent. Fact 22. No guard on Machamp and Golurk made all moves hit, regardless of accuracy, creating reliability that evasion couldn't circumvent and that accuracy checks didn't limit. The guaranteed accuracy made Dynamic Punch and Stone Edge and other inaccurate moves into safe choices, whose power wasn't balanced by mischance anymore, creating shift where high-power moves became reliable, making no guard into ability that move pool considerations changed through making previously risky moves into safe options whose power could be relied upon. Fact 23. Iron Fist on Conkeldurr and others boosted punching moves by 20%, creating synergy with move pool that punching moves dominated, making ability into relevant boost for Pokémon, whose coverage consisted primarily of punches. The boost made punch-based attackers into more threatening through ability and move pool alignment, creating specialization where fighting types, whose natural move pool emphasized punching, became more powerful, making Iron Fist into ability that Pokémon with appropriate move pool benefited from substantially while being irrelevant to Pokémon without punching moves. Fact 24. Skill link on. Cloyster made multi-hit moves, always hit maximum 5 times, creating consistency that randomness normally prevented through guaranteeing best outcome. The consistency transformed moves like Icicle Spear from unreliable into reliable, making Cloyster into Setup Sweeper, whose Shell Smash plus Skill Link combination created devastating offensive presence that multi-hit moves maximized. Through ability, ensuring damage output was predictable rather than variable, making Skill Link into ability that particular moves synergized with creating optimal combinations. Fact 25. Chlorophyll, Swift, Swim, and Sand Rush as hidden abilities doubled speed in respective weather, creating weather-dependent sweepers whose effectiveness required weather support. The speed doubling transformed slow Pokémon into fast sweepers whose viability depended on weather, making weather teams into optimal contexts for these abilities, creating interdependence where weather setters and weather abusers needed each other, making team composition consideration where weather abilities created synergies, requiring specific team structures for maximizing effectiveness. Fact 26. Thick fat on Venusaur, Mamoswine, and others gave resistances to fire and ice attacks, creating defensive utility against types that would normally threaten. The resistance-granting ability transformed type matchups through making super effective attacks into neutral attacks, creating defensive profile that typing alone wouldn't suggest, making thick fat into ability that coverage requirements changed through making fire and ice coverage less effective, requiring different coverage moves for handling thick fat users effectively. Fact 27. Water Absorb, Volt Absorb, and Flash Fire as hidden abilities provided immunity plus healing or boost when hit by respective type, creating defensive advantages against common attacking types. The absorbing abilities created favorable matchups against types that normally would threaten, creating switches that gained advantage rather than taking damage, making absorb abilities into switch-in opportunities that team composition capitalized on through bringing absorb ability users into predicted attacks, gaining healing or boosts that normal predicted SIG switches wouldn't provide. Fact 28. Poison Heal on Gliscor. Healed instead of taking damage when poisoned, creating synergy with Toxic Orb that guaranteed poison for reliable healing. The healing transformation made status condition beneficial, requiring intentional poisoning through Toxic Orb for activating ability, making Poison Heal into ability that item synergy enabled, creating optimal combination where poison that normally harmed instead healed, making status into advantage that Gliscor exploited through immunity to other status, plus healing that poison provided. Fact 29. Marvel Scale on Milotic raised defense by 50% when afflicted with status condition, creating defensive boost that status normally wouldn't provide, creating irony where attempts to cripple actually strengthened. The defense boost made statusing milotic counterproductive through improving defensive stats, that special walls relied on making status into mistake that opponents learned to avoid through experience, that Marvel Scale punished attempts to weaken through status, making ability into protection from status-based strategies. Fact 30. Scrappy on Kangaskhan and Miltank allowed normal and fighting moves to hit ghost types, creating coverage that type immunity normally prevented, making these types reliable stab rather than situationally useless. The immunity bypassing ability made ghost types unable to wall normal types whose stab moves could now hit everything, creating consistency that type matchups normally prevented through making ghost immunity irrelevant, making Scrappy into ability that improved reliability through eliminating immunity that would otherwise require coverage moves for addressing. Fact 31. Competitive and Defiant raised special attack or attack, respectively by 2 stages, when any stat was lowered, creating anti-intimidate abilities, plus general protection against stat drops. The stat-raising retaliation made debuffing risky through turning debuffs into buffs, making opponents hesitant to use stat-lowering moves or abilities, creating deterrent effect where presence of competitive or defiant discouraged. Strategies that relied on lowering stats, making abilities into protective measures that threat alone made effective. Fact 32. Guts, Marvel Scale, and Quick Feet transformed status conditions from hindrances into advantages, raising attack, defense, or speed respectively when afflicted, creating status-immune Pokémon that status actually strengthened. The status-reversing abilities made inflicting status counterproductive through improving rather than hindering, making status moves into mistakes against these abilities, creating situations where normal status strategies backfired, through making opponents stronger rather than weaker when status that should cripple instead empowers. Fact 33. Sturdy, preventing OHKO when at full HP, created survival insurance that made setup possible through guaranteeing at least 1 turn of survival, allowing focus sash effect without item. The survival guarantee made sturdy users into reliable lead Pokémon or setup sweepers whose strategy required surviving initial hit-making ability into enabler of strategies that frailty would otherwise prevent through ensuring that full HP Pokémon survived, creating window for setup or revenge that OHKO would eliminate without Sturdy's protection. Fact 34. Infiltrator on Crobat and others bypassed Substitute, Light Screen, Reflect, and Safeguard, creating ability that screens didn't protect against, making screen teams vulnerable to Infiltrator users. The bypass ability made defensive screens less reliable through creating counter that screens couldn't prevent, making Infiltrator into check on screen-based strategies whose effectiveness diminished. When opponents possessed ability that protections didn't stop, making Infiltrator valuable specifically in metagames where screens were common, creating contextual value. Fact 35. Own tempo, preventing confusion on Lickitung and Glalie, seemed minor, until terrain confusion introduced in later generations made own tempo grant immunity to intimidate, creating unexpected utility that original design didn't intend. The ability evolution demonstrated how mechanics changes across generations, altered ability values when new interactions created benefits that original implementation didn't envision, making abilities potentially more valuable as game evolved, adding mechanics that existing abilities interacted with in beneficial ways. And so concludes the first part of our hidden abilities journey. Having explored their introduction through Dream World, the weather-setting abilities that define Generation V, the powerful offensive abilities like Speed Boost and Protean that created dominant Pokémon, the defensive utilities like Magic Bounce and Regenerator providing support, the synergies between abilities and items or moves, and the meta-defining impacts where hidden abilities transformed competitive landscapes. Rest now if sleep calls, or continue to part 2 where we'll discover more hidden abilities, their strategic applications, the obtainment methods across generations, and the breeding mechanics that hidden abilities complicated. Sleep gently, dear friends. Welcome back, dear friends, to our continuing exploration of hidden abilities. In this second part, we'll discover the complex breeding mechanics that hidden ability inheritance follows, explore the various obtainment methods that evolved across generations, making hidden abilities progressively more accessible, examine the strategic decisions about when hidden abilities surpass standard abilities and when they don't, investigate the tier impacts where certain hidden abilities elevated Pokémon into higher competitive viability, uncover the ability move synergies that optimal strategies exploit, and reveal the hidden costs where hidden abilities benefits come with drawbacks that careful analysis recognizes. So settle back comfortably, close your eyes when sleep beckons, and let us continue this gentle journey through the strategic depths of hidden abilities. Fact 36. Hidden ability inheritance through breeding requires female parent with hidden ability breeding with male of same egg group, creating 60% chance that offspring inherits hidden ability rather than standard ability. The inheritance mechanics made obtaining hidden ability specimens into breeding projects requiring female with desired hidden ability as starting point, making gender ratio important consideration when 87.5% male species, like starters made female hidden ability specimens rare, creating value hierarchy where female hidden ability starters commanded premium in trading economy. Fact 37. The introduction of males and genderless Pokémon being able to pass hidden abilities when breeding with Ditto in Generation VI democratized hidden ability breeding, making male hidden ability specimens useful rather than worthless. The mechanic change eliminated frustration where male hidden ability Pokémon couldn't pass ability, making them breeding dead ends requiring female specimens for continuing lineage, making Ditto into essential breeding partner, whose universal compatibility enabled hidden ability inheritance from males that same species breeding wouldn't permit. Fact 38. Friend Safari in Generation V6 provided guaranteed hidden ability encounters, creating reliable method for obtaining hidden abilities that Dreamworld's shutdown had made unavailable. The Safari replaced Dreamworld as primary source, creating accessibility that online services discontinuation would have eliminated, making Friend Safari into essential feature for competitive players whose teams required hidden abilities that normal encounters didn't provide, making Safari completion into breeding preparation that optimal teams necessitated. Fact 39. Horde encounters in Generation 6 gave small chance of hidden ability appearing among 5 wild Pokémon, creating grinding method that persistence eventually rewarded. The Horde method made obtaining hidden abilities into time investment rather than into luck-based lottery, creating path where dedicated players could obtain specimens through repeated encounters that eventually produced hidden ability. Individual making ability acquisition into achievable goal rather than into impossible dream that pure RNG would make frustrating. Fact 40. Sauce battle chains in Generation 7 increased hidden ability encounter rate as chain lengthened, creating method where patience and chain maintenance eventually guaranteed hidden ability encounters. The chaining mechanic rewarded skill through requiring chain preservation while progressively improving odds, making hidden ability hunting into engaging activity rather than into passive grinding, creating gameplay where performance affected outcomes, making ability hunting into challenge rather than into mindless repetition. Fact 41. Max raid battles in Generation 8 featured hidden abilities, frequently with 5-star raids, often containing hidden ability specimens, creating abundant source that previous scarcity transformed into relative accessibility. The raid abundance made hidden abilities common rather than rare, shifting value proposition from having hidden ability to having optimal hidden ability specimen with perfect IVs, and nature making hidden abilities baseline expectation rather than special achievement, creating power creep where hidden abilities became standard rather than exceptional. Fact 42. Ability patch introduced in Generation 8 allowed changing any ability to hidden ability, creating ultimate accessibility where hidden abilities could be added to any specimen, eliminating need for hidden ability breeding. The patch made hidden abilities completely accessible, removing final barrier that gender ratios and breeding mechanics created, making optimization purely matter of obtaining patch rather than matter of breeding perfect specimen with hidden ability, making ward patch into ultimate quality of life improvement that breeding frustration eliminated. Fact 43. The strategic decision between standard abilities and hidden abilities isn't always obvious, with some Pokémon preferring standard abilities despite hidden abilities existing, creating choices that team composition and strategy determine. The decision-making demonstrates that hidden abilities aren't automatically superior, making ability choice into meaningful selection rather than into automatic optimization, where hidden ability is obviously correct, making standard abilities viable when their effects suited strategy better than hidden ability effects did. Fact 44. Intimidate as standard ability often surpasses hidden abilities through providing immediate utility that entering battle creates, making intimidate into ability whose value exceeds many hidden abilities. The comparison shows that some standard abilities are exceptionally powerful, making hidden abilities into alternatives rather than into upgrades, creating situations where hidden ability provides different utility but not necessarily superior utility, making ability choice into preference rather than into optimization, creating legitimate decisions. Fact 45. Levitate as standard ability, providing ground immunity, is often more valuable than hidden abilities that don't provide immunity, making levitate users hesitant to use hidden abilities. The immunity value demonstrates that defensive utilities from standard abilities sometimes outweigh offensive utilities from hidden abilities, creating calculations where avoiding super effective damage matters more than dealing extra damage, making levitate into ability that hidden abilities struggle competing with through providing irreplaceable defensive value. Fact 46. Sand Rush on Excadrill combined with Sandstream Tyranitar or Hippowdon created Sand Team Core, where automatic Sandstorm doubled Excadrill's speed, making it into sweeper. The team synergy demonstrated how hidden abilities enabled archetype strategies that required specific ability combinations, creating team-building constraints where Excadrill's viability depended on teammate providing weather that Sand Rush exploited, making hidden ability into team-dependent feature rather than independent strength. Fact 47. Chlorophyll Venusaur on Sun teams created special attacker whose speed doubled under Sun that Drought provided, creating fast growth-boosted sweeper. The synergy between hidden ability and weather plus boosting move created optimal combination where multiple elements aligned, making Venusaur into threatening presence that Sun enabled through speed that Chlorophyll provided and power that growth accumulated, making hidden ability essential to strategy that wouldn't function with standard abilities. Fact 48. Swift, Swim Kingdra, or Ludicolo on rain teams created fast special attackers whose speed doubled in rain while water moves gained power, creating offensive presence. The weather abuse created by Swift Swim made rain teams into viable archetype whose success depended on hidden abilities that speed provided, making weather teams into hidden ability-dependent strategies that standard abilities couldn't replicate, making hidden abilities into enablers of entire team archetypes. Fact 49. Contrary Serperior with Leaf Storm created Setup Sweeper that boosted special attack while dealing damage, creating combination that standard mechanics didn't permit. The reverse stat change transformed Leaf Storm from risky move with drawback into optimal move without downside, creating synergy that made Contrary essential to Serperior's competitive viability, demonstrating how single, hidden ability transformed mediocre Pokémon into threatening sweeper through mechanic reversal. Fact 50. Sheer Force Nidoking with Life Orb lost recoil when using moves with secondary effects that Sheer Force removed, creating powerful attacker without cost. The item ability synergy created optimal combination where Life Orb's power boost was free, making Sheer Force users into ideal Life Orb holders whose offensive presence exceeded normal Life Orb users through avoiding recoil that usually balanced items' power, making hidden ability into economic advantage through eliminating cost. Fact 51. Magic Guard on Clefable prevented indirect damage from status, weather, entry hazards, and Life Orb recoil, creating durability that made Clefable into exceptional tank. The immunity to indirect damage made Clefable into wall whose longevity exceeded Pokémon that residual damage wore down, making Magic Guard into survival tool that made Clefable viable in formats where passive damage accumulated, making ability into protection that sustainability enabled, making Clefable into reliable team member whose presence persisted. Fact 52. Prankster Sableye before Fairy-type introduction had no weaknesses while giving priority to status moves, creating ultimate support that couldn't be threatened. The combination of defensive typing plus offensive utility made Prankster Sableye into oppressive support whose Will-O-Wisp, Recover, and Taunt all had priority, making Sableye into unmanageable support until Fairy-type created weakness that previously didn't exist, demonstrating how typing plus ability combinations created overpowered Pokémon that mechanic changes addressed. Fact 53. Parental Bond on Mega Kangaskhan doubled attacks, making each move hit twice, with second hit at half power, creating DPS that exceeded normal damage output. The double hitting ability made Kangaskhan into banned from standard play Pokémon whose power broke game balance through effective 1.5 times damage multiplier on all attacks, making every move devastating, creating example where hidden ability on Mega Evolution created unbeatable combination that competitive formats couldn't accommodate, requiring ban for maintaining competitive integrity. Fact 54. Tough Claws on Mega Charizard X boosted contact moves by 30%, creating physical attacker whose Flare Blitz and Dragon Claw hit exceptionally hard. The contact boost made physical moves preferred, creating specialization, where Mega Charizard X functioned completely differently from special attacker Mega Charizard Y, whose Drought plus special moves created different role, demonstrating how hidden abilities on Mega Evolutions created divergent strategies from same base. Pokémonday Fact 55. Aerolate, Pixelate, Refrigerate, and Galvanize converted normal type moves into other types while boosting power by 20%, creating stab on moves that wouldn't normally have type advantage. The type converting abilities made normal moves into typed moves, creating synergies where Hyper Voice became Fairy type, with Boost making Sylveon's Pixelate Hyper Voice into powerful stab move that normal type wouldn't provide, creating abilities that fundamental move mechanics altered through type conversion. Fact 56. Stance change on Aegislash switched between Blade Form A and Shield Form when using attacks or King's Shield, creating dynamic defensive and offensive stats. The Form A changing ability made Aegislash into unique Pokémon whose stats fluctuated, creating mind games where predicting Form A determined counterplay, making Aegislash into skill-testing Pokémon whose ability created gameplay depth through prediction requirements that static stats wouldn't create, making stance change into ability that interactivity maximized. Fact 57. Disguise on Mimikyu blocked first damaging hit, creating free turn where setup moves could be used safely, knowing damage wouldn't occur. The damage blocking ability made Mimikyu into reliable setup sweeper whose Swords Dance or Substitute could be used freely, making Disguise into sturdy equivalent that persisted beyond full HP, making Mimikyu into threatening sweeper whose free turn setup made it into offensive presence that couldn't be prevented from setting up. Fact 58. Battle Bond on Greninja allowed transformation into Ash Greninja after KOing opponent, creating stronger Form A with boosted stats. The transformation created snowball effect, similar to Moxie, where initial KO improved offensive presence, making subsequent KOs easier, creating sweeping potential that momentum built, making Battle Bond into ability that required getting started, but which dominated once initial KO was achieved, making Greninja into late-game cleaner whose transformation swept weakened teams. Fact 59. Power Construct on Zygarde triggered transformation into complete Form A at 50% HP or below, creating dramatic stat increase mid-battle. The transformation made Zygarde into tank that became more threatening when damaged, creating reverse psychology where damaging Zygarde triggered transformation that made it harder to defeat, making Power Construct into ability that discouraged dealing damage, creating stalling strategy where Zygarde waited for transformation before becoming aggressive, making ability into strategic timing consideration. Fact 60. Guerrilla Tactics on Darmanitan locked moves like Choice Band, but without item creating power boost that item slot freed for other use. The locked move restriction created specialization, where Darmanitan became Wall Breaker, that item freedom enhanced through allowing Choice Scarf for speed or Life Orb for additional power, creating flexibility, that ability providing choice effect enabled through not requiring item that normal choice mechanics demanded, making guerrilla tactics into pseudo-choice ability that item slot liberated. Fact 61. Libero on Cinderace changed type to match move used, creating Protean equivalent that made Cinderace into unpredictable attacker, with stab on everything. The type changing created coverage that few Pokémon matched through receiving stab on all attacks, making move selection into type selection, creating gameplay where coverage and stab maximization merged, making Libero into ability that made Cinderace into versatile attacker whose type was whatever move it selected, making defensive preparation impossible. Fact 62. Unseen Fist on Urshifu allowed contact moves to ignore protection, creating ability that bypassed protect and detect, making defensive counterplay unavailable. The protection piercing ability made Urshifu into threat that couldn't be stalled, creating offensive pressure that defensive plays couldn't avoid, making Unseen Fist into ability that removed defensive options, forcing opponents into offensive responses that couldn't delay damage that Urshifu inflicted, regardless of defensive moves, making ability into protection negation. Fact 63. As one on Calorex's fusions combined, Unnerve with Chilling Neigh or Grim Neigh, creating dual ability effect that stat boosts after KOs plus preventing berry usage combined. The dual ability demonstrated unique mechanics that legendary fusions possessed, creating abilities that standard Pokémon couldn't have, making fusion mechanics distinct through ability combinations that normal rules didn't permit, creating exceptional cases where ability rules were different, making fusions mechanically unique. Fact 64. Neutralizing gas on Wheezing suppressed all abilities, while Wheezing was active, creating ability negation that removed opponent abilities and ally abilities. The suppression created team strategies where ability-less Pokémon became viable through Wheezing, removing abilities that would be problematic, creating archetype where neutralizing gas enabled strategies that opponent abilities would prevent, making Wheezing into support that ability removal enabled, creating strategies that ability dependence normally prevented. Fact 65. Pastel Veil on Galarian Ponyta prevented poison on user and cured poison on allies when entering battle, creating team support that status removal provided. The team healing ability made Galarian Ponyta into support that status-based teams struggled against through poison becoming unreliable, creating deterrent, where poison strategies became less effective when Galarian Ponyta threatened entry, creating ability whose presence alone discouraged particular strategies, making Pastel Veil into meta-influence beyond just mechanical effect. Fact 66. Wandering Spirit on Runerigus swapped abilities with attacker when hit by contact move, creating disruption that opponent abilities became Runnerigus's abilities, while opponents received Wandering Spirit. The ability swapping created chaos, where contact moves became risky through ability exchange that might benefit Runerigus while hurting opponent, creating mind games where contact avoidance became necessary, making Wandering Spirit into ability that move selection influenced through making contact moves potentially detrimental. Fact 67. Ripen on Appleton doubled berry effects, creating enhanced berry utility that made berries twice as effective. The berry enhancement made specific berries extremely powerful when Ripen doubled their effects, creating synergies where berry selection mattered, creating optimization where best berries became even better through doubling, making Ripen into ability that item choice significantly affected through berry interactions, being doubled, making item selection into important decision. Fact 68. Ice Face on Ice Cue blocked first physical hit while changing form A, creating physical immunity that form A change indicated. The physical protection made Ice Cue into physical wall, whose ability granted free turn against physical attackers, creating specialization where physical threats couldn't damage immediately, making Ice Face into physical equivalent of disguise that physical attacks specifically countered, creating defensive utility against physical but not special attackers. Fact 69. Stalwart and Propeller Tail on various Pokémon ignored redirection effects, making moves hit intended targets despite redirection attempts. The redirection immunity created reliability in doubles formats, where Follow Me and Rage Powder could redirect attacks, making these abilities valuable specifically in doubles, where redirection was common, creating format-dependent value where singles made abilities irrelevant, but doubles made them essential for hitting intended targets. Fact 70. Analytic on Behaim and others boosted move power by 30% when moving last, creating incentive for slow Pokémon to maximize damage. The power boost rewarded moving last, creating optimization where Trick Room or natural slowness became advantages, making analytic into ability that speed inversely correlated with power, creating unusual optimization where being slower was beneficial, unlike normal speed optimization that valued going first, making analytic into reversal of normal speed priorities. And so concludes the second part of our hidden abilities journey, having explored the complex breeding mechanics that gender and inheritance follow, the evolution of obtainment methods from Dream World through Friend Safari, through ability patches, the strategic decisions where hidden abilities aren't always optimal, the team synergies where hidden abilities enabled weather and other strategies, the item ability combinations that optimal play exploited, and the mega evolution and legendary exclusive abilities that standard Pokémon couldn't access. Rest now if sleep calls, or continue to part 3 where we'll discover competitive impacts, tier placements, and the meta-defining moments where hidden abilities changed everything. Sleep gently, dear friends. Welcome back, dear friends, to our continuing exploration of hidden abilities. In this third part, we'll discover how hidden abilities transformed competitive tiers, elevating previously unused Pokémon into viability, explore the ban list history, where overpowered hidden abilities necessitated restrictions, examine the format differences where abilities that dominate singles struggle in doubles, investigate the generational changes where nerfs and buffs altered ability power levels, uncover the creative strategies that hidden abilities enabled through unconventional combinations, and reveal the prediction mind games that ability uncertainty creates when opponents don't know which ability you possess. So settle back comfortably, close your eyes when sleep beckons, and let us continue this gentle journey through competitive depths where hidden abilities determine outcomes. Fact 71. The introduction of hidden abilities in Generation V created immediate tier shifts where Pokémon like Politoed jumped from lower tiers into OU, overused, purely through drizzle access. The tier movement demonstrated that single ability could transform viability completely, making previously unviable Pokémon into essential team members whose usage statistics reflected ability value rather than stat quality, showing that hidden abilities mattered more than base stats for determining competitive placement when ability provided unique utility that stats alone couldn't replicate. Fact 72. Blaziken's ban to Uber's tier resulted from speed boost, creating unstoppable sweeper that standard play couldn't contain, making Blaziken first non-legendary Pokémon banned primarily for hidden ability. The ban established precedent that hidden abilities could be too powerful for standard formats, creating recognition that ability balance mattered for competitive integrity, making Blaziken into cautionary example that subsequent hidden abilities were designed around avoiding, repeating, creating lesson that automatic stat boosts without counterplay broke competitive balance. Fact 73. Excadrill's temporary ban during Generation V resulted from Sand Rush plus Permanent Sandstorm, creating unmanageable speed advantage that no counterplay addressed satisfactorily. The ban was eventually reversed when metagame adapted, creating example where initial assessment deemed ability too strong but experience proved that counterplay existed, making Excadrill into Pokémon whose ban history demonstrated how competitive understanding evolved through practice, revealing counters that theory hadn't identified, making unbanning legitimate when metagame development proved initial ban was premature. Fact 74. Swagger ban in later generations resulted partly from prankster users making confusion plus attack boost into unmanageable combination that luck determined outcomes. The move ban rather than ability ban demonstrated that abilities could make otherwise balanced moves into problematic combinations, creating indirect nerf, where ability remained, but move that ability made oppressive was banned, showing that problem-solving sometimes targeted moves rather than abilities, when move was issued specifically in context of priority that prankster provided. Fact 75. Moody's ban in most competitive formats resulted from random stat boosts, creating excessive RNG that skill couldn't manage, making battles into dice rolls. The ability ban demonstrated that competitive play rejected mechanics that luck dominated over skill, creating philosophy that predictability and counterplay mattered more than mechanical diversity, making Moody into unacceptable ability, whose random nature competitive formats excluded despite being legal in-game, creating disconnect between game mechanics and competitive rules. Fact 76. Shadow Tag on Gothitelle and Mega Gengar was banned or restricted in various formats through trapping without counterplay, creating unescapable situations. The trapping ability made switching impossible, creating scenarios where Pokémon were forced to stay in unfavorable matchups, making Shadow Tag into ability that fundamental battle mechanics violated through removing switching that normal play assumed was always available, making trapping into problematic mechanic that competitive formats regulated through ability restrictions. Fact 77. Arena Trap on Dugtrio was banned from standard play despite Dugtrio's mediocre stats through trapping ability, creating unavoidable revenge killing. The ban demonstrated that ability could make weak Pokémon overpowered through providing utility that stats didn't reflect, making Dugtrio into problem despite being statistically unimpressive, showing that competitive problems derived from mechanics rather than from numbers, making Arena Trap into lesson that trapping was problematic regardless of user strength. Fact 78. Doubles format viability differs dramatically from singles, with abilities like Intimidate becoming more powerful through affecting multiple opponents, while abilities like Speed Boost become less dominant. The format differences demonstrated that ability value was context dependent, making tier lists format specific, creating situation where competitive evaluation required specifying format, since abilities that dominated singles were mediocre in doubles, and vice versa, making format into essential context for assessing ability strength. Fact 79. Fake Out plus Prankster Tailwind or Thunderwave created doubles strategies where turn 1 control was nearly guaranteed through priority status plus flinch. The combination demonstrated how doubles strategies exploited abilities differently than singles through having partner whose Fake Out protected prankster user whose status moves established advantages that singles couldn't replicate, through having ally support, making doubles into format where ability combinations between partners mattered, creating team synergy considerations. Fact 80. Intimidate cycling in doubles, where multiple intimidate users rotated, maintaining constant attack drops, created oppressive strategy that physical attackers couldn't overcome. The rotation strategy demonstrated how doubles enabled ability, stacking through, having multiple users whose switching accumulated effects, creating strategy that singles couldn't replicate through having only one Pokémon active, whose Intimidate activated only on that Pokémon's switches, making doubles into format where multiple sources of same ability created exponential value. Fact 81. Wide guard and quick guard protection in doubles made Stalwart and Propeller Tail valuable through bypassing spread move protection. The protection moves made certain abilities valuable, specifically in doubles where protecting ally from spread moves mattered, creating format-specific utility that singles didn't value, making abilities that ignored protection into doubles-specific considerations that singles players disregarded, creating format-dependent ability evaluation. Fact 82. Follow Me plus Discharge strategy exploited Lightning Rod to redirect damage, while allies discharge hit opponents but healed Lightning Rod user. The redirection absorption combination demonstrated creative ability usage where mechanics interacted, creating strategies that neither ability individually suggested, creating discovery process where players found synergies that designed hadn't explicitly intended, making ability interactions into emergent strategies that creative team building revealed. Fact 83. Justified plus beat-up strategy used allies' multi-hit move to activate Justified multiple times, raising attack dramatically. The self-targeting strategy demonstrated unconventional ability use, where attacking ally activated ability, creating setup that moves multi-hit nature amplified, creating cheese strategy that competitive formats sometimes banned through being unintended interaction that design hadn't anticipated, making beat up plus justified into example where mechanics loopholes created broken combinations. Fact 84. Weakness. Policy plus competitive or defiant created strategies where deliberate stat drops triggered policy activation while ability offset drops. The self-debuff strategies demonstrated counterintuitive optimization where intentionally triggering negative effects activated beneficial effects, creating net positive, making abilities into tools for self-activation, strategies that normal use patterns wouldn't employ, showing that creative thinking found uses that obvious applications missed. Fact 85. Unburden plus consumable item strategies made Pokémon extremely fast after consuming berry or gem, creating speed doubling that lasted rest of battle. The speed boost strategies made Unburden into setup mechanic that item consumption triggered, creating one-time transformation where slow Pokémon became extremely fast, creating strategic timing where item consumption determined when speed boost activated, making Unburden into ability that item timing considerations made complex. Fact 86. Belly Drum plus Unburden plus Citrus Berry created Slurpuff strategy, where setup maximized attack while berry consumption doubled speed. The combination demonstrated multi-step setup, where ability and move and item synergized, creating sweeper that one turn created, making Slurpuff into threatening presence that setup enabled, showing how ability move item combinations created strategies that components individually wouldn't suggest, making team building into puzzle, where finding synergies rewarded creativity. Fact 87. King's Rock plus Serene Grace plus multi-hit moves created flinch strategies, where Sky Attack had 64% flinch chance. The flinch stacking demonstrated how abilities multiplied item effects, creating combinations that made flinching consistent rather than occasional, making Serene Grace into ability that item and move selection optimized through, maximizing secondary effect chances that ability doubled, making strategic considerations extend beyond just ability into whole moveset and item optimization. Fact 88. Substitute plus Belly Drum plus Salackberry plus Unburden created elaborate setup sequence where one turn established maximum attack plus doubled speed plus substitute. The complex setup demonstrated optimization where multiple mechanics combined, creating ideal state that sequence achieved, showing that ability was component in larger strategy, requiring specific ordering and specific supporting elements, making Unburden into ability that setup sequences incorporated rather than into standalone feature. Fact 89. Choice Scarf. Surprise on Pokémon with hidden ability made prediction difficult through opponents not knowing whether to expect standard ability or hidden ability plus item. The uncertainty created mind games where hidden ability possibility made Choice Scarf unexpected, creating prediction difficulty that standard abilities wouldn't create through making build ambiguous until revealed, making hidden abilities into sources of competitive surprise through creating multiple viable builds that opponents couldn't distinguish until battle revealed which build was used. Fact 90. Regenerator plus pivoting moves created cycling strategies where U-turn or volt switch allowed switching while healing, making regenerator users into sustainable pivots. The pivot strategies demonstrated ability move synergies, where switching moves gained additional value through healing that regenerator provided, creating preference for pivot moves on regenerator users whose switching wasn't costly due to healing, making pivoting into optimal strategy that ability rewards through making frequent switching sustainable rather than gradually depleting health. Fact 91. Sand Force, Snow Cloak, and similar weather-based abilities created weather-dependent strategies that required specific conditions. The conditional abilities demonstrated that some hidden abilities were niche, requiring team support for functionality, making them into specialist tools rather than universal improvements, creating evaluation complexity where abilities were situationally powerful but broadly weak, making them into risk-reward considerations, where building around ability could be powerful but required commitment. Fact 92. Harvest on Trevenant with Citrus. Berry created infinite healing when used in Sun through berry restoration, allowing continuous consumption. The infinite resource demonstrated ability that consumable items made renewable, creating sustainability that normal item use couldn't achieve, making harvest into ability that item selection mattered critically for with berries, becoming infinitely reusable, making Trevenant into wall whose healing never depleted in appropriate weather conditions. Fact 93. Compound Eyes on Galvantula made Thunder 91% accurate rather than 70%, making previously unreliable move into consistent option. The accuracy boost demonstrated how abilities made risky moves safe, creating preference shifts where high-power inaccurate moves became optimal choices. That accuracy boost made reliable, transforming move pool optimization through making moves that normal Pokemon avoided into moves that Compound Eyes users preferred, making ability into move set consideration. Fact 94. Download on Porygon Z and Genesect raised attack or special attack based on opponent's lower defense, creating automatic boost. That stat comparison determined. The comparative boost demonstrated ability that opponent's stats influenced, creating variability, where same Pokemon boosted different stats against different opponents, making download into ability whose effect was matchup dependent, creating unpredictability that download user couldn't fully control, making ability into stat check mechanic. Fact 95. Anticipation on various Pokemon detected super effective moves, or OHKO moves, providing information that Team Preview didn't reveal. The detection ability provided pre-battle intelligence, creating information that advantage that scouting provided, making anticipation into ability whose value was informational rather than mechanical, creating utility through revealing opponent capabilities that hidden information normally protected, making anticipation into competitive reconnaissance tool. Fact 96. Slow start on Regigigas halved. Attack and speed for 5 turns, creating crippling drawback that made potentially powerful Pokemon nearly useless. The negative ability demonstrated that not all abilities were beneficial, creating example where ability was curse rather than blessing, making Regigigas into Pokemon whose ability prevented rather than enabled competitive use, showing that abilities could be balancing mechanisms that prevented Pokemon from being too strong, making slow start into intentional handicap. Fact 97. Truant on Slaking, forced resting every other turn, creating similar handicap that made exceptional stats balanced through ability that prevented consecutive actions. The forced inactivity demonstrated deliberate design where ability compensated for stats, creating Pokemon whose power was theoretical rather than practical, making Truant into ability that made strong Pokemon weak through preventing consistent action, showing that abilities served balancing functions, limiting Pokemon that stats alone would make overpowered. Fact 98. Defeatist on Archeops halved offensive stats below 50% HP, creating ability that made Archeops progressively weaker as battle continued. The self-weakening ability demonstrated negative abilities that made Pokemon worse rather than better, creating intentional handicaps that prevented Archeops from dominating through having excellent stats that Defeatist prevented from being consistently useful, making ability into balancing mechanism that stat-based power controlled. Fact 99. Klutz on Lopunny prevented item effects, creating ability that was purely negative, making held items useless. The item negating ability seemed incomprehensible as hidden ability choice until Mega Evolution was introduced, making Klutz irrelevant on Mega Lopunny, creating ability that existed primarily to not matter, showing that some abilities were placeholders whose presence didn't meaningfully affect Pokemon, whose true power came from Mega Evolution that replaced ability. Fact 100. Stall on Sableye made it move last in priority bracket, creating guaranteed last movement that typically wasn't desirable. The negative priority demonstrated ability that was disadvantage, creating question about why hidden ability would be worse than standard ability, making Stall into ability whose utility was obscure, making Sableye players prefer Prankster. Standard ability over stall hidden ability that made Sableye slower, showing that hidden abilities weren't always improvements. Fact 101. Emergency exit and wimp out on Golisopod and Wimpod forced switching when HP dropped below 50%, creating automatic escape that strategy sometimes didn't want. The forced switching demonstrated abilities that removed player control, creating situations where Pokémon was removed from battle against players' wishes, making abilities into double-edged mechanics that benefit and hindrance, combined creating complexity, where abilities helped through providing escape, but hindered through forcing switches that strategy might not want. Fact 102. Schooling on Wishy-Washy changed forme based on HP, creating dramatic stat changes that battle progression influenced. The form changing demonstrated abilities that battle state determined, creating dynamic, where Wishy-Washy was powerful initially but became weak when damaged, creating time pressure, where Wishy-Washy needed to accomplish goals before damage reduced it to weaker form, making ability into timer that battle duration raced against. Fact 103. Power of Alchemy and Receiver on Alolan, Muck, and Passimian copied allies' ability when ally fainted, creating inheritance in doubles. The inheritance abilities demonstrated double-specific mechanics, where ally fainting provided benefit through ability transfer, creating silver lining, where loss gained advantage, making these abilities into doubles tools that singles couldn't utilize, making format consideration essential for evaluating abilities that ally interaction required for functioning. Fact 104. Battery and Power Spot as ally buffing abilities in doubles boosted partners' special attacks, creating support that direct combat didn't involve. The support abilities demonstrated non-combat utilities, where abilities benefited teammates rather than users, creating support roles where Pokemon's value came from enabling partner rather than from personal combat, making abilities into force multipliers whose value was vicarious through making ally stronger rather than user stronger. Fact 105. Illusion on Zoroark disguised it as last party member, creating mind games where opponent didn't know Zoroark was present until illusion broke. The disguise ability created deception that information warfare enabled, making Zoroark into psychological weapon, whose strength was opponent confusion rather than stats, making illusion into ability that bluffing and misdirection exploited, creating gameplay where meta-knowledge and prediction mattered more than mechanics, showing that some abilities created mental rather than mechanical advantages. And so concludes the third part of our hidden abilities journey, having explored tier shifts where abilities elevated Pokémon into higher usage, ban list history where overpowered abilities required restrictions, format differences where singles and doubles valued abilities differently, creative strategies exploiting ability move item synergies, prediction mind games where ability uncertainty created advantage, negative abilities that handicapped powerful Pokémon, and psychological warfare where illusion created deception. Rest now if sleep calls, or continue to final part where we'll discover remaining abilities, their niche uses, the future of hidden abilities, and ultimate significance of this secret power system. Sleep gently, dear friends. Welcome back, dear friends, to the final part of our comprehensive exploration of hidden abilities. In this concluding section, we'll discover the niche abilities that serve specific purposes in unusual strategies, explore the underappreciated hidden abilities that competitive players overlook, examine how hidden abilities affect casual play versus competitive optimization, investigate the design philosophy behind ability distribution, uncover the future possibilities for hidden ability expansion, and conclude with reflections on what this secret power system teaches about depth, choice, and the pursuit of optimization in Pokemon's endlessly fascinating strategic landscape. So settle back one final time, close your eyes whenever sleep beckons, and let us complete this gentle journey through every hidden corner of this remarkable mechanic. Fact 106. Overcoat on Mandibuzz and others provided immunity to weather damage and powder moves, creating niche defensive utility against specific strategies. The immunity ability made weather-immune Pokémon viable in weather-heavy metagames, where residual damage accumulated, making Overcoat into anti-weather tool that specialized builds used when facing weather teams whose chip, damage, Overcoat nullified, making ability valuable specifically against strategies that weather abuse employed, creating contextual value that general play didn't recognize. Fact 107. Telepathy on Musharna and Orbeetle prevented damage from allies spread moves in doubles, creating coordination tool that friendly fire eliminated. The ally protection ability made telepathy users immune to earthquake, discharge, and other spread moves that normally damaged everyone, creating synergy with allies using spread moves whose collateral damage telepathy prevented, making ability into double-specific utility that spread move strategies incorporated. Through having immune ally whose telepathy allowed aggressive spread move usage without concern. Fact 108. Plus and minus on Plusle and Minun boosted special attack when paired with each other, creating duo strategy that required both for functioning. The paired abilities demonstrated designed synergies where abilities worked together, creating team composition requirements, where Plusle and Minun together gained benefits that individually they lacked, making abilities into complementary pair whose value derived from combination rather than from individual effect, creating duo archetype that pair-dependent abilities enabled. Fact 109. Honey gather on Combi allowed finding honey after battles, creating resource gathering ability that combat didn't involve. The out-of-battle utility demonstrated that some abilities served non-combat purposes, creating value that battles didn't measure, making honey gather into economic ability whose worth was resource generation rather than battle effectiveness, showing that abilities had purposes beyond combat optimization when utility extended to exploration and gathering that gameplay involved. Fact 110. Pick up on Zigzagoon and others found items after battles, creating treasure hunting ability that adventure made valuable. The item finding ability created incentive for keeping pickup users in party, making them valuable for resource accumulation that battles provided as side benefit, making pickup into ability that casual play valued more than competitive playthrough, providing tangible rewards that item scarcity made desirable, creating utility that competitive formats couldn't measure. Fact 111. Frisk on Banette and Noivern revealed opponents' held item before battle began, providing intelligence that item-dependent strategies benefited from. The scouting ability created information advantage where knowing opponent's item informed strategy, making Frisk into reconnaissance tool whose value was knowledge rather than power, creating utility for players who valued information. That blind prediction wouldn't provide, making Frisk into competitive intelligence gathering that item knowledge enabled. Fact 112. Forewarn on Jinx detected opponent's strongest move, providing partial moveset information that strategic planning used. The move detection ability gave preview of what opponent could do, making forewarn into scouting tool. That threat assessment benefited from when strongest move knowledge, informed switching and positioning, decisions making ability into information utility. That prediction improved through reducing uncertainty about opponent capabilities that hidden movesets normally protected. Fact 113. Cacophony as unused ability in game data suggested future sound-based immunity, creating speculation about abilities that existed in code but weren't assigned. The unused abilities demonstrated that design included abilities that implementation didn't utilize, creating mystery about why certain abilities existed but weren't available, suggesting that development process created more abilities than game included, leaving dormant abilities that future generations might activate, making unused abilities into speculation fodder. Fact 114. Soundproof on Xploud and Mr. Mime provided immunity to sound-based moves, creating niche defense against sound strategies. The sound immunity made soundproof users immune to boom burst, hyper voice, and perish song, creating defensive utility against sound-based teams whose strategies soundproof countered through blanket immunity, making ability valuable specifically against sound strategies while being irrelevant against non-sound strategies, creating highly situational value that metagame composition determined. Fact 115. Lightning Rod and Storm Drain as hidden abilities redirected electric or water moves in doubles, while providing immunity plus stat boost. The redirection abilities created protective utility, where Pokémon absorbed attacks aimed at allies while gaining boosts, making them into sacrificial protectors whose redirection shielded partners, while strengthening redirector creating our protectors. Dual utility, where defense and offense combined through protection, that empowerment rewarded, making abilities into double support tools. Fact 116. Symbiosis on Florges and Oranguru, passed item to ally after ally, consumed their item, creating doubles support that item sustainability provided. The item sharing ability made symbiosis users into item reserves whose held item transferred to ally after consumption, creating strategy where ally consumed item while backup item was available, making symbiosis into doubles logistics. Support that item management enabled through providing item redundancy that normal rules didn't permit. Fact 117. Tangling Hair on Diglett's Alolan form reduced opponent's speed upon physical contact, creating debuff that contact moves triggered. The contact punishment created defensive utility where physical attackers that made contact suffered speed loss, making Tangling Hair into anti-physical ability that contact dependence meant not all physical moves triggered, creating inconsistency where some physical attacks activated ability while projectile physical moves didn't, making contact distinction important for ability activation. Fact 118. Cursed Body on Gengar had chance to disable move that hit user, creating disruption that luck determined. The random disable created unpredictability, where sometimes key moves were disabled, creating advantage that RNG provided, making Cursed Body into luck-based ability whose value fluctuated based on which move was disabled and whether disable activated, making ability into variable utility that consistency players disliked through unreliability that Cursed Body's chance activation created. Fact 119. Weak armor on Onyx and Caracosta raised speed while lowering defense when hit by physical attacks, creating stat trade that physical hits triggered. The trade-off demonstrated abilities that converted damage into benefit, creating silver lining, where being hit gained advantage, making weak armor into ability that physical attackers inadvertently activated, empowering user through making them faster while making them frailer, creating dynamic, where repeated hits made user very fast but very fragile. Fact 120. Rattled on Sudowoodo. Raised speed when hit by bug, dark, or ghost moves, creating fear response that speed boost represented. The type-specific boost demonstrated conditional abilities that certain attacks triggered, creating situational value where ability activated against specific types while being irrelevant against other types, making rattled into niche ability whose value depended on facing appropriate types, making team preview important for knowing whether ability would activate. Fact 121. Justified on Terrakion and Cobalion, raised attack when hit by dark type moves, creating counter boost against type that threatened. The retaliation boost created defensive utility against dark types, whose attacks backfired through boosting opponent, making justified into anti-dark ability that made dark coverage risky against justified users, creating matchup. A consideration where dark moves were avoided against justified users whose attack boost punished dark type usage. Fact 122. Water compaction on Palisand, sharply raised defense when hit by water moves, creating defensive boost against type that threatened. The counter boost transformed super effective damage into defensive advantage, creating situation where water attacks that should be effective actually strengthened, making water compaction into ability that water coverage became liability against, making Palisand into ground type that water types struggled against, despite type advantage that water compaction converted into disadvantage. Fact 123. Steam engine on Rolycoly and Coalossal, sharply raised speed when hit by fire or water moves, creating mobility boost that temperature change represented. The dual trigger boost demonstrated abilities that multiple types activated, creating flexibility where fire teams and water teams both triggered ability, making steam engine into ability that activated frequently through having two trigger types rather than single type, making activation more likely, creating consistent value that multiple triggers enabled. Fact 124. Sand spit on Silicobra automatically summoned Sandstorm when hit, creating weather setting that damage triggered. The reactive weather demonstrated abilities that conditions established through being attacked, creating weather that opponent damage caused, making Sand spit into ability that physical bulk encouraged through surviving hits that triggered. Sandstorm, making durability important for ability that required taking damage for activating weather that sand strategies needed. Fact 125. Perish Body on Cursula activated Perish Song when hit by contact move, creating mutual KO timer. The Revenge ability created threat, where physical attackers that made contact triggered Perish count on both Pokémon, creating situation where Cursula could trade eliminations, making Perish Body into deterrent against contact moves, whose risk was mutual KO that timer established, making physical attackers hesitant to make contact when Perish Body threatened mutually assured destruction. Fact 126. Mirror armor on Corviknight reflected stat lowering effects back at source, creating immunity to debuffs, plus turning debuffs against debuffer. The reflection ability made stat lowering risky against Corviknight, whose mirror armor meant intimidate and other debuffs backfired, making Corviknight into anti-debuff specialist that debuffing strategies avoided through reflecting, making Corviknight immune to stat lowering while making opponents suffer effects they attempted to inflict, creating defensive utility against debuff strategies. Fact 127. Cotton Down on Eldegoss lowered speed of all other Pokémon when hit, creating area debuff that damage triggered. The field effect demonstrated abilities that affected everyone, creating indiscriminate debuff where allies also suffered. Speed loss making Cotton Down into double-edged ability that team composition considerations required accounting for when ally speed loss was acceptable cost for ensuring opponent speed loss that area effect created. Fact 128. Screen Cleaner on Mr. Rhyme removed light screen and reflect from both sides when entering battle, creating screen removal that entry activated. The screen removal demonstrated abilities that field conditions affected, creating utility against screen teams whose defensive setup Screen Cleaner eliminated, making Mr. Rhyme into anti-screen specialist whose presence removed screens that screen teams depended on, creating metacall that screen-heavy formats valued while screen-absent formats disregarded. Fact 129. Ice Scales on Frosmoth halved special damage received, creating special defense that ice types rarely possessed. The damage reduction made Frosmoth into special wall, despite ice types' normally poor defensive profile, creating exception where ice type could tank special attacks, making Ice Scales into defensive utility that ice types typically lacked, through having defensive typing that ice types' multiple weaknesses normally prevented, making Ice Scales essential to Frosmoth's viability. Fact 130. Punk Rock on Toxtricity boosted sound moves by 30%, while reducing sound move damage received, creating offensive and defensive utility for sound strategies. The dual-purpose ability made Toxtricity into sound specialist, whose sound moves hit harder, while opponent sound moves hit softer, creating synergy with sound-based move pool that Punk Rock rewarded through boosting signature moves, while protecting against sound-based threats, making ability into thematic match with Toxtricity's musical design. Fact 131. Gulp Missile on Cramorant caused form change after surf or dive, catching prey that spat at attackers when Cramorant was hit. The reactive form created ability that moved activated, then opponent attacks triggered, creating multi-step activation where using specific moves, prepared ability that subsequent damage activated, making Gulp Missile into conditional ability requiring setup through specific moves before defensive utility became available, creating gameplay sequence that ability demanded. Fact 132. Hunger Switch on Morpeko changed form and type each turn, alternating between electric and dark, creating periodic transformation. The alternating form created predictability where type changed on schedule, making planning possible through knowing which type would be active on which turns, creating rhythm that both players knew, making Hunger Switch into ability that turn, counting, determined, creating transparent transformation that strategy accommodated through knowing form schedule. Fact 133. Quick Draw on Obstagoon gave 30% chance to move first in priority bracket, creating speed randomness that luck determined. The chance priority demonstrated RNG abilities that consistency lacked, making Quick Draw into unreliable ability whose activation was unpredictable, creating situations where sometimes Pokemon moved first and sometimes didn't, making ability into dice roll, that competitive play disliked through introducing luck, that skill couldn't influence, making quick draw into controversial ability. Fact 134. Unseen Fist on Urshifu's single strike style allowed contact moves to bypass protect, creating protection piercing that contact moves employed. The protection bypass made defensive moves unreliable against Urshifu, whose attacks ignored protection, creating offensive pressure that couldn't be stalled, making Unseen Fist into ability that removed defensive options, forcing offensive responses that delay tactics couldn't employ, making Urshifu into aggressive threat that defensive counterplay couldn't manage. Fact 135. Chilling Neigh and Grim Neigh on Calyrex's fusion forms raised attack or special attack after KOing opponent, creating snowball effect. The KO triggered boost created momentum where initial KO made subsequent KOs easier, creating sweep potential that victory accumulated, making abilities into late-game tools that weakened teams couldn't defend against when boosts accumulated, overwhelming remaining opponents, making Calyrex fusions into cleanup sweepers whose boosts made them progressively threatening. Fact 136. Curio's Medicine on Sinistra cleared allies' stat changes on switch-in, creating reset that's sometimes beneficial, sometimes detrimental, depending on whether ally had positive or negative stat changes. The indiscriminate clearing demonstrated abilities that weren't purely beneficial, creating complexity where ability could help or hurt, depending on context, making Curio's Medicine into situational ability whose value depended on whether clearing stats was advantageous, making ability into double-edged tool. Fact 137. The design philosophy behind hidden abilities involved providing alternatives that created meaningful choices rather than creating strict upgrades, making ability selection into strategic decision rather than obvious optimization. The design intent demonstrated that hidden abilities aim to create diversity rather than power creep, making standard abilities remain viable through hidden abilities, providing different utility rather than superior utility, creating balance where both options were legitimate depending on strategy and team composition. Fact 138. The future of hidden abilities likely involves continued expansion with new generations, adding hidden abilities to existing Pokémon, creating ongoing evolution of competitive landscape. The expansion potential demonstrated that hidden abilities weren't finished system but continuing project, where future additions would create new strategies and new optimizations, making hidden abilities into dynamic system that generations developed, rather than static feature that initial implementation completed, making future generations ability additions into anticipated content. Fact 139. The accessibility improvements across generations, from Dream World through Friend Safari, through ability patches, demonstrated commitment to making hidden abilities available while maintaining some acquisition effort. The accessibility evolution showed that balance between exclusivity and availability shifted toward availability, creating progression where initial scarcity gave way to eventual accessibility, making hidden abilities into feature that optimization required, rather than into luxury that only dedicated players possessed, making competitive play more accessible through hidden ability availability. Fact 140. Hidden abilities ultimately represent Pokemon's commitment to depth and to meaningful choice, creating systems where optimization involves decisions rather than obvious answers, where abilities create strategic diversity that team composition explores, where standard and hidden abilities both have validity depending on context and strategy, and where pursuit of perfect specimen involves engagement with breeding and battling and trading that community fosters through shared pursuit of optimization, that hidden abilities incentivize through providing goals that dedication achieves, making hidden abilities into system that rewards investment, while teaching that optimization involves understanding context, where different abilities serve different purposes, making perfect build into question that team and strategy answer rather than into universal truth that applies regardless of circumstances. The hidden ability system demonstrates game design excellence through creating layer that beginners can ignore while providing depth that experts optimize, creating accessibility through standard abilities, working fine while providing ceiling through hidden abilities, enabling strategies that standard abilities couldn't support, making hidden abilities into optional optimization that competitive play values while casual play disregards, creating bifurcated design that serves multiple audiences simultaneously through making system that matters when optimization matters while being irrelevant when just enjoying game without competitive aspirations, making hidden abilities perfect example of how Pokémon accommodates players across skill spectrum, from casual enjoyers through competitive optimizers, creating game that works at multiple levels through systems that optional depth provides for those who seek it while remaining enjoyable for those who don't engage with complexity that competitive play demands, when hidden abilities and other optimization systems create skill ceiling that mastery pursues, while floor remains accessible to beginners whose standard abilities serve adequately. And so we conclude our comprehensive journey through 140 facts about hidden abilities, having explored their introduction through Dreamworld, creating initial scarcity, the weather-setting abilities that defined early competitive landscape, the powerful offensive abilities that created dominant threats, the defensive utilities that support strategies enabled, the complex breeding mechanics that gender ratios and inheritance governed, the evolution of obtainment methods across generations, making abilities progressively accessible, the strategic decisions where hidden abilities weren't always optimal, the team synergies that weather and other strategies exploited, the competitive impacts where abilities transformed tiers and created bans, the format differences where singles and doubles valued abilities differently, the creative strategies that ability move item combinations produced, the niche applications that specific situations valued, and ultimately, the design philosophy that created meaningful choices rather than obvious upgrades, making hidden abilities into system that depth and diversity served rather than into power creep that made standard abilities obsolete. The lasting significance of hidden abilities extends beyond just providing alternative options into demonstrating game design principles about how depth and accessibility can coexist through creating systems that beginners can ignore while experts optimize, teaching that perfect Pokémon isn't universal truth, but context-dependent answer, that team composition and strategy determine, making optimization into art rather than into science, where formulas produce answers, and showing how persistent engagement with systems reveals depths that surface understanding misses through hidden abilities, creating breeding projects and strategic considerations and team-building decisions that mastery explores, while casual play disregards creating game that accommodates multiple engagement levels simultaneously through systems that optional depth provides. The philosophy underlying hidden abilities suggests that meaningful choice requires alternatives that serve different purposes rather than alternatives that serve same purpose with different power levels, teaching that diversity derives from providing options that different strategies value rather than from providing options that everyone recognizes as superior or inferior, making choice into strategic consideration that context determines, rather than into optimization puzzle that mathematics solves, making hidden abilities into example of how game design creates engagement through requiring thinking rather than through requiring calculation, where answers are obvious to those who understand numbers, making hidden abilities into system that judgment and understanding reward more than system that computation and memorization reward. Sleep now, dear friends, having completed this exhaustive exploration of hidden abilities whose secret powers transformed competitive Pokémon through creating layer that depth and variety provided, making battles more interesting through abilities that strategies enabled and through choices that team composition required, making hidden abilities into essential feature that modern Pokémon depends on for competitive diversity, that standard abilities alone wouldn't provide through lacking variety, that hidden abilities introduced, making competitive play richer through hidden abilities, creating options that strategies explore, finding synergies that design enabled through careful ability distribution, that balance maintained while allowing creativity, that optimal combinations rewarded. Thank you for joining this comprehensive journey through hidden abilities, from their introduction through their current state, across generations, that refined and expanded system that initially Dream World monopolized, but which subsequent obtainment methods democratized, making hidden abilities accessible to players whose dedication, breeding, and battling demonstrated through persistence that perfect specimens required when obtaining optimal ability was project that patience achieved, making hidden abilities into goals that motivation sustained through battles and breeding and trading that hidden ability acquisition required before ability patches made process trivial through allowing conversion that made hidden abilities universal rather than scarce, making current accessibility testament to how Pokémon evolved toward removing barriers while maintaining depth that systems like hidden abilities provided. Rest peacefully knowing that hidden abilities exist, providing strategic depth that optimization explores, that perfect Pokémon requires consideration beyond just stats when abilities matter for determining viability, that strategic thinking involves context, where different abilities serve different purposes, making choices meaningful rather than obvious, that game design can create depth without creating complexity that excludes beginners, when systems are optional rather than mandatory, making hidden abilities perfect example of accessible depth that skill ceiling raises without skill floor, elevating, and that Pokemon's enduring appeal partly derives from systems like hidden abilities that provide goals and that reward engagement, making investment worthwhile through creating tangible improvements that breeding produces, making perfect specimens into achievements that dedication creates. Sweet dreams of secret powers waiting within Pokémon for discovery through breeding that reveals hidden abilities, of strategic decisions where ability choice determines viability, of team synergies where abilities combine creating strategies, of competitive battles where abilities create advantages that preparation produced through obtaining optimal specimens, of breeding projects that persistence completed, producing perfect Pokémon whose hidden abilities, optimal movesets complemented, and of understanding that depth enriches experience when systems reward exploration through providing discoveries that surface engagement misses, making hidden abilities into invitation toward deeper understanding that mastery develops. Through engaging with systems that casual play doesn't require, but which optimization values, making hidden abilities into bridge between casual and competitive play that both can cross when ready. Good night forever, dear trainers who appreciate depth that systems provide. Sleep among hidden powers waiting for discovery. Rest in knowledge that optimization is journey rather than destination. Dream of perfect Pokémon whose hidden abilities, strategies enable. Good night.